Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Teresa Martin with ASCB. I want to welcome you to our webinar for the day, the do's and don'ts of publishing a research article. I will give you a second as all of our participants join us. And Kita, you can go ahead and turn on your camera.
Okay, as Teresa said, welcome to our webinar today, the do's and don'ts of publishing a research article. My name is Ankita Patil. I am a graduate student at Drexel University in Philadelphia and part of ASCB's Compass, which is its student and postdoc committee. I have a co-host here today, Arvin Jane Donovan, and the two of us will be moderating questions. So we encourage you to ask your questions using the Q&A function that you'll see below. Our speaker for today is Dr. Stephen J. Fleisler. This is a long title now. SUNY Distinguished Professor and Meyer Rushin Endowed Chair, Professor of Ophthalmology and Vice Chair Director of Research at SUNY Buffalo and the VA Western New York Healthcare System. Dr. Fleisler, if you want to go ahead with your talk now.
Thank you very much, Ankita, and also Avin for hosting this. So today I'm giving a presentation that is really intended for the novice graduate students, postdoctoral fellows who may not have much familiarity in the publication business. This is going to be an essential skill for you as you continue in your ongoing career in science. So I have no disclosures, and for the objectives for today is basically to help you to know the rules of the road, navigating the publishing process successfully, choosing the right venue for publishing your work, to give you some insights to what journal editors look for, the criteria of manuscripts. I am currently the editor-in-chief of Experimental Eye Research, and last year I handled over 1,000 manuscript submissions, so I have quite a bit of practice looking at incoming manuscripts. The core content is how to construct a publishable paper, all of the elements. I also go over the ICMJE recommendations, and I'll get to those in a moment. Also at the end, I will talk about publishing ethics, a very important aspect of engaging in the publishing enterprise, and then talking about electronic publishing resources at the end. So there are some very essential resources that you should be aware of. Number one is this recommendations for the conduct, reporting, editing, and publication of scholarly work in medical journals. This is freely available on the website from the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, the ICMJE. There are literally thousands of books out there, some of which you may be able to get on Amazon for very inexpensively, to guide you how to write a manuscript and how to submit manuscripts in the current environment. But let's get to the first things first. The first thing is making the correct choice for the appropriate journal in which to publish your work. So foremost, you have to consider the implications of your research. Who is your intended audience? What is the message that you are intending to communicate to the reader? As people who are relatively new to the field, I would urge you to talk to colleagues, talk to your mentors, professors in your departments, to ask them what journals that they read and what journals do they have a high regard for. Where are the papers primarily in your field published? That would be the kind of vehicle that you would want to use in which to publish your work. It would be a good idea. Let's say you have selected a few possibilities. Browse through back issues to understand the scope of the journal, who publishes there, what kinds of things are published there. And also you might want to consider something like the impact factor. And this is a quantifiable numerical score, if you will, that is published every year, usually on an annual basis, as well as a composite, such as a 4 or 5 year composite impact factor. And in general, and I'll talk about impact factor in a little bit, but you would want to go to journals that have higher impact factor than ones less than 1, for instance, okay? Also, you should look at the instructions to the authors to check that the format that you've chosen is acceptable for the journal in which you intend to publish your work. So, for instance, you don't want to send a review article to a journal that only publishes original research. So be sure that the kind of vehicle that you're going to want to publish is acceptable by the journal. So the very first thing that you want to do after you make the choice of the journal is to check out the instructions for that journal to the authors, okay? So this, I cannot overemphasize this. Read the directions, okay? Today, I received a manuscript from an established investigator, a short communication, and as soon as I started looking at this paper, I realized the author didn't read the instructions because the format for his manuscript was not in compliance with the stipulated format for my particular journal. And I had to send back the manuscript unreviewed, instructing the author to read the directions and to comply with the stipulations for formatting and style of our journal. So where you can find this information is on the journal website. And if you have a physical print version of the journal, typically you're going to find the guide to authors in the inside, either in the front cover or the back cover of that journal. So in the instructions to authors, sometimes called guide to authors, there are points of journal style, how you should lay out the text in your manuscript, whether or not you need to have headings and subheadings like introduction, material and methods, results and conclusions or discussion. There may be stipulations on the length of the abstract, length of the text that's acceptable, the style of literature citation. For instance, in experimental eye research, we use alphabetical style. So you have the last name of the first author, and then if there are multiple authors, it's that last name and then et al, and then the year of publication. That's inserted in the text body, and then the reference list is then alphabetized accordingly, as opposed to a numerical style where journals put a 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever for the citation, either in brackets or as a superscript numeral. Then there will be stipulations about the style and formatting of illustrations, figures, whether you want to use black and white versus color, whether or not you should have labels on or any other annotations that are allowable on those figures. And the same goes for tables. Then you get specific directions on exactly how to submit the manuscript. Again, this is typically on the web portal, and these days, essentially all manuscripts are submitted electronically. And even though you think you know what you're doing, read the directions again, okay? You may have missed something, okay? So let's look at a premier journal of this particular scientific society, the Journal of Cell Biology. And you can see on the upper right-hand corner, you can see this submit. You click on that and it will give all of the guidance that you need on constructing your manuscript and how to submit it. Another example of the Journal of American Medical Association, a very high-tier journal. Their webpage also give you explicit directions. The instructions to authors are shown there, how to submit and track your manuscript, and various other pertinent information to guide you in the submission process. So there are categories of articles that are specified, and in the instructions to authors, the journal will tell you exactly the kinds of manuscripts they are willing to consider. So more typically, original full-length research articles, and this is predicated also on the understanding, and in fact, you have to give written assurance that this work is original and has not been previously published, and it is not also under consideration currently by any other journal. Then there are possibly short communications in the clinical literature. These are known as case reports. Also, there are other kinds of contributions, such as letters to the editor or commentary pieces. Sometimes you might be invited to give a commentary or an editorial. And then there are many journals that publish review articles. In addition, which is the kind of thing that you possibly won't encounter as a regular author, but editors mostly would use special communications or alerts to alert the readership about a particular event. So each journal has its own scope and types of articles that they accept for publication, and they have their own restrictions on form and style for each of these categories of articles for submission. So what are things like people like me, who's an editor, look for? So the first thing is the material original, and is it of high quality? Is the information that's being conveyed in the manuscript, is it important, significant to the field? Will it have an impact on the scientific discipline? Is the writing clear and grammatically correct? And does the style conform to the guidelines that are specified in the instructions for authors? Now, this is a point that I encounter on a regular basis as an editor, because we have submissions from all over the world, and in many cases from countries where English isn't the primary language. So English is a difficult language, and it is hard often for people whose language isn't primarily English to construct sentences, use correct word choice, have correct grammar. In these cases, there are numerous professional English editing services that are available to you. You can search these on Google, and most of the publishers also have, as a fee for service, English editing services. For instance, Elsevier is one of the largest biomedical and scientific publisher in the world. They handle over 1,400 life sciences journals, and they have editing services, and even the editing services can be regional, such as Asia Pacific. So also we look to see if the design of the study has been appropriate. Are the methods that have been applied, are they appropriate to address to the questions that are testing the hypothesis that has been laid out in the study? Then are the data valid? Are they reproducible? Are they statistically significant? Was the appropriate statistical analysis applied? Then whether or not the conclusions toward the end of the manuscript, putting the results into context, are they actually supported by the data? And then does the topic being addressed, is it of general biomedical interest, or is it more discipline specific that is focused on the interests of a particular target audience of the journal? So Some journals have exceedingly stringent acceptance criteria and only publish a small percentage of articles submitted, such as the higher tier journals, Science, Nature, Cell, and the like. They can have over a 90% rejection rate. So these your manuscripts going there is going to be held to a higher standard than perhaps in discipline-specific journals. So it's very, very important that you choose the correct journal for your manuscript. You should aim high, but within reason. And you should consider the chances of success of your manuscript for being accepted. So I just have 4 examples that probably almost everybody who's listening to this webinar have knowledge of. Cell is one of the higher tier impact factor journals. Its impact factor is over 30. Science impact factor is over 24 currently. Nature is over 42 currently. And even the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences has an impact factor of greater than 10. Many of the discipline-specific journals have impact factors in the 2 to 5 range more typically. And then there are just an explosion of online-only journals that you probably receive solicitations for a dozen or times more in a day. I certainly do. And a lot of these journals have impact factors of less than 1 because they just only recently came about. So, think about trying to pitch your work at the highest tier journal that would be likely to publish your work, but also don't go the other way and go too low, okay? This is just a kind of a fun journal, the Journal of Irreproducible Results, that I recommend to you for leisure reading. So let's go into the components of a manuscript, and these are typical. First, more often than not, you will be required to have an abstract. This is basically a summary of what the reader is going to encounter in your manuscript, and it's typically restricted to 250 to 300 words. Some journals allow maybe up to even 500, but this is more typical. There are some journals that have what's called a structured abstract, which means that it has subheadings such as purpose or background, and then methods, and then the results and the conclusions. Experimental eye research uses a continuous narrative, so no subheadings. And I can tell when a manuscript had been previously submitted and rejected by one of the competing journals to experimental eye research when I see a structured abstract submitted for a manuscript that comes across my desk. Then you typically have an introduction, and it's usually labeled as such. Some journals, just the text immediately starts without a heading such as introduction, but this gives the fundamental background for the reader to understand what you're doing, what is the purpose of this study, what has been done previously, gives the historical context, and then where are the gaps and what are you trying to do to fill those gaps. So then you have to tell people, how did you do your study? That's the materials and the methods section. And this typically is also highly structured as well. And then after that presentation of how you did the work, then you tell people, what did you find? So the results of your study, the data, and that is described in text version. And then there are attendant figures and figure legends and possibly tables. And sometimes there are even supplementary material that is auxiliary material that is accessible separately from the main manuscript. And then you pull together all of the results and tell the readership what does it all mean? The discussion section, the conclusions, what can the reasonable person make of the data that you've just presented? And did you in fact answer the question that you set out to answer, the gaps that you intended to fill in, address successfully the guiding hypothesis of your research or not? And then there's a section of acknowledgments for people that contributed, and I'll talk about authorship versus contributorship in a moment. And then you have to give the historical context, the background of prior work, methods, and what have you that enabled you to do this research. That is given in the literature citations. And in manuscripts, the tables and the figures and figure legends typically are submitted at the very end after all of the foregoing, as opposed to being directly embedded in the text body of the manuscript. And as I mentioned, there may also be supplemental materials that gives the reader further understanding of detailed points of experimental design or experimental results, but they're not the main points that the author wants to explicate and show to the public in the main body of the manuscript. So starting at the front is the face page, or some kind it's called the title page. So this gives you the title of the article. It gives the author list, who qualified as an author, and gives their institutional affiliations and also the contact information for the communicating author. There must be a designated corresponding or communicating author. That contact information is provided, usually gives their institutional address followed by an email and sometimes phone and fax information. This is essential because the publishing home office that is going to be handling all of the correspondence and the mechanics of the manuscript submission and review has to have that context for contacting you as the communicating author for the entire process. Many journals also require what's called a running title or short title, which is a kind of contracted distillation of the full title of your article. Then typically there's a list of keywords. They may be either on that same face page, or more typically they go on a separate page, and they're usually restricted to a maximum of 5 or 6 words. And then there's a list of abbreviations that may be essential for giving context to the reader, to understanding the various abbreviations that are used throughout the text, and also those might also be designated on a separate page. So some journals discourage using headers and footers, footnotes with author ID on subsequent manuscript pages, such as the first author's last name et al. And in this case, this is to ensure that you have what used to be called a blind review, now we call masked, especially for somebody like me who's in the ophthalmic research discipline. We don't like the word blind because it has a different kind of context. So other items, for instance, many journals now have a highlight section, which is a distillation of the main key points of the findings that are described at length in the manuscript. Typically, these are organized as bullet points. And in addition, you might have a visual aid to the highlights, which is called a graphical abstract, an image that's designed to give the reader an instant overview, a gestalt, if you were, of the content of the article. So an example of a graphical abstract is shown below on this slide from a manuscript that we published just this past year. And then there are figures, graphs or line art, or illustration, photographs, photomicrographs that are essential to convey the data, the findings that you've discovered in the course of your study. These have to be very high quality, high resolution. The pixels or the megabytes that are required by the journal will be stipulated. They must conform to the journal's specifications in size, placement, whether or not they should have, a capital A, capital B, capital C for panel numbers, or 1, 2, and 3, whether it's allowable to have arrows and sub-labels on or not. Then you have to consider how many of these figures are sufficient and essential to convey the information you're trying to relate to your target audience. Other thing is that, so you might have way too many. You might want to rethink about that, what are essential, okay? And there might be too few to convey the information that you want to get off to your readership, okay? Another thing you have to consider is whether you absolutely need color to get the point across, as opposed to, for instance, a lot of bar graphs or line graphs could be black and white, simple without color. One of the considerations, and this is not insignificant, is that color costs. So in print journals, this can run you $2,000 or $3,000 per plate on a journal printed page. It tends to be much less on electronic only reproduction because the costs are not involved in electronic publishing like it is with print. Okay, so the journals will give you guidance as to what are the costs is, and also how many figures are allowable to be published in color. There are some journals that offers, for instance, if you're a professional society member, a paid member, whether you're a student member versus a full member, you might be given a price break for the color charges that are applied. In addition, for some journals, if you are invited to publish, for instance, a review article, and you want to have color figures, the journal may decide to waive any color reproduction charges. So you'll have to pursue that in the instructions to the authors, okay? So this is very important. Submitted figures, and this is all done electronically as JPEGs or TIFF or PNG files. They may be subject, in fact, I would say almost certainly they will be subject to a scrutiny, looking for signs in manipulations. For instance, that they're on a Western blot, you were expecting to see a band at 36 kilodaltons, but there's almost nothing there. So you use Photoshop and just drop a little band in where you want it. Or maybe you would like to show that your mono-specific antibody is monospecific, but you have 15 bands on your Western blot. So you just Photoshop erase them and remove them. That is strictly unethical. In fact, it is research misconduct. Things like ramping up the gain to take a very, very faint signal to make it stand out more. That's image manipulation. So there was an article published several years ago by Nicholas Wade, who was a science writer in the New York Times. The title was, "It May Look Authentic. Here's How to Tell It Isn't." Most journals are instituting this scrutiny of electronic images. So here's the article from the New York Times. And this particular evaluation said since 2002, when the test was put in place, 25% of all accepted manuscripts have had one or more illustrations that were manipulated in ways that violate the journal's guidelines. So this is the Journal of Cell Biology, okay? The editor at that time, Ira Melman, who was at Yale, said that most cases were resolved when the authors provided original copies, and in 1% of the cases, they found that authors engaged in outright fraud. I can tell you that since then, those numbers had skyrocketed. And I've handled no less than 15 cases for my journal in the last 2 years of suspected fraud, falsification, or fabrication. Okay, so you've written your manuscript, you've gotten everything together per the specifications of the guide for the authors. Now you're going to encounter various forms. One, there's typically a checklist that are items specified by the journal so that you do have all of your ducks in a row for submitting your manuscript. Then there's something called a copyright transfer agreement. Usually it is allowable for the communicating or corresponding author to sign this on behalf of all of the co-authors, but for some journals, it is actually required that every author individually sign this copyright transfer agreement, okay? And what this is for is, and this may be an uncomfortable concept, all of this hard work of yours that you put into your manuscript and you're submitting for publication, when you sign this copyright transfer agreement, you no longer own that work. The manuscript and its content becomes the property of the copyright owner, which is the publisher in this case. Not all journals do this, but most do. You will sign other authorizations, the allowance to reproduce material from another copyrighted source, such as maybe from one of your prior publications that you would like to illustrate and help the readership to understand your work better. And you might say, okay, this was previously published work, and you give the literature citation, and you're also required to have written authorization to reproduce that previously published and copyrighted information. More often than not, this comes up in publishing review articles or in book chapters. There are other assurances, a formal statement regarding the ethical treatment of animals or human subjects used, and you typically have to give the IACUC protocol authorization number or the IRB authorization number if you're using human subjects. Also, there is a written statement that the manuscript is original. It's not under consideration for publication elsewhere. I had handled no less than 3 cases since January where those statements were made on the cover letter, not as a separate form, but just embedded directly in the cover letter, and then subsequently found out that that exact same manuscript had been submitted to another journal at the exact same time, and they also signed their name to a statement that said this is not under consideration for publication elsewhere. So clearly that was not a true statement. All co-authors, you have to attest that all co-authors reviewed and approved the final version of the manuscript being submitted. So for instance, I've encountered cases where early drafts of a manuscript had been circulated to co-authors, maybe at other institutions, and then all of a sudden those co-authors get a notification that there's been a manuscript submitted with their name, when then they never saw the actual final version or were given the opportunity to review and to authorize and approve the submission of the manuscript. So this is a written authorization and assurance that states that everyone who's listed as a co-author has seen and approved the version that is being submitted to the journal. Okay. Now, typically, journals ask for a cover letter. This should be more often than not on a electronic form, but on the official letterhead that kind of verifies that you actually are employed by a bona fide research-oriented institution or academic institution or research institute. This may be seem trivial, but it's actually important if you're using something other than a generic to the editor. If you give the name, or name the editor by name, you should have the correct name of the current editor, not a previous editor that retired 3 years ago, or as a correspondence that I received just this morning for a communication. The letter was addressed to, instead of me, but a editorial board member who isn't authorized to receive directly manuscript for consideration. So, most importantly, you should describe succinctly, very abbreviated form, the high points of what you found, why this will be of interest to the readership of this journal, what's your key message, what are the implications or significance of the findings that you're putting forward. Also, you should give a rationale for why you're submitting to this particular journal as opposed to, let's say, some other journal, okay? Your letter should demonstrate that you have an understanding of the journal's readership and also the historical context of your work, previously published work, possibly that appeared in that journal, which definitely helps your case for showing relevance. And then also consult the instruction to authors for specific wording that that journal might require, such as the paper is not being considered for publication by other journals, et cetera, that you may have been required to fill out as a separate assurances form. And this is an important thing. Journal editors actually invite and like to receive suggestions for people who have appropriate discipline-specific knowledge that could be a good reviewer for your paper. That person, by the way, or persons, should not have any conflict of interest. So they can't be from your own institution. They can't be a recent co-author with you. Obviously, it can't be somebody who's related to you. And also, you can do this for journals, but in other venues such as grant submissions, here in this venue, you can also ask for certain people to not be sent your work. People who you think might have a predisposed negative bias against you. Somebody who is possibly a direct competitor of yours who you don't necessarily want to know about what you've just discovered, okay? That is perfectly acceptable. You can make recommendations. They may or may not be followed. I can tell you as an editor, when somebody specifically asks me to exclude a referee, I always honor that. And I think that it's the only right thing to do. But we may or may not take your recommendations for reviewers. So now you've submitted the manuscript. So what will happen is the journal will acknowledge the receipt of your submission with an email, and it will be assigned a reference number. And they tell you explicitly you must use that number for all future correspondence, because that is a primary way to track your submission in their electronic editorial management system. Once you've received this acknowledgement, just cool your jets, okay? Just sit back and wait for a reasonable period of time to hear about it. Because what happens, and I'll explain the process in a moment, but there's multiple steps after you hit that send button and get the response from the journal. It's going to take a while for referees to be identified, to agree to review your work. They are given a time frame for allowed time for reviewing and submitting a written review. It also could happen that the editors or assigned sub-editors might have trouble in identifying and getting people to agree to review your work. This often happens, for instance, over winter holiday period, summer recess periods, or spring break periods for academic institutions. So it can take quite a while. Even though the journal may say, we expect that you get your review back to us in 10 days, it's rare that that actually happens, okay? So most journals will aim to make a decision on your submitted manuscript somewhere in the 2 to 3 weeks range. Most of the time, submission to the final decision could be a couple, maybe even 3 months. It takes time, as I mentioned, to solicit and receive referee reports. Now, I wouldn't wait forever. If you don't receive a decision within this, let's say, a couple of 2-month time period, it is perfectly allowable, acceptable, and in fact, I would encourage you to do this, to send an email to the editor, with a accession number and title of your manuscript, and inquire what is the status of your manuscript, saying you have not received any decision. And that could prompt the editor to find out what is going on with the manuscript that was most likely submitted to a sub-editor, a section editor, another editorial board member that's further down the food chain from the editor-in-chief. Now, don't forget, these journals could have thousands of current manuscript in play. So you can't expect that the editor or even the editorial board members will be tracking your particular manuscript. So here are the stages of the process. The editorial office receives your manuscript. The editor, or possibly associate editor, a section editor, assigns it to an editorial board member. And that editorial board members then starts to solicit potential referees to review your manuscript, and they usually specify a time frame, let's say 2 weeks, to receive those reviewer reports, okay? Now, a certain amount of time, this is all done by email, a certain amount of time is going to pass. Some people, maybe the request that went out to by the editorial board member went to their junk mail. So they don't even know that they were asked to review a manuscript. Well, let's say they did receive it, but they put it off because they were busy writing their own manuscript or submitting a grant or teaching, or they're on vacation or whatever. So it can take a while. And then also people, mull it over, and then they say, no, you know what, I just don't have time to do it, or it's outside my expertise, and for whatever reason, they decline to review. Now the editorial board member has to solicit other referees. This all takes time, okay? So then eventually, if you usually they ask for no less than 2 independent reviews. I like to get 3 in case I need a tiebreaker, if you will, if the referee reports are disparate. So the referees will file their review report. The editorial board member makes a recommendation to the editor, associate editor, and then that editor, associate editor informs you, the author, of the decision, okay? So this can be journal specific. This is a general outline for the process. So what are the possible outcomes? Well, if you submit to Science or Cell or Nature, more often than not, by the time the electron trail of your email of submission dries out in the cyberspace, you get a rejection letter, okay? I'll tell you how to deal with this, okay? Or you might get a rejection, but an invitation to make major changes and resubmit. Sometimes you'll be told this is going to take so much revisions that you're going to have to resubmit this as a new manuscript, not just a revised manuscript. And usually your revised manuscript with a detailed response point by point to the criticisms goes to back to the same referees that it went to originally. Or you might get a conditional acceptance that pending relatively modest revisions based on the referee comments, it will be reconsidered and evaluated. And this is fairly rare that you get a unconditional, no revisions required, immediate acceptance. This is rare. I have about 150 peer-reviewed publications, and I've received this response twice in my entire life. Other people maybe are more lucky than I am, but this is a fairly rare occurrence. So, what if your manuscript is rejected? All right, don't freak out, okay? Don't jump off a bridge. Just read the referee's comments, and maybe there's additional editors' comments. Read them carefully after the initial disappointment has worn off. And what I would suggest you do is put those away for a while. Put them in your drawer, put them in your computer file for a few days, and then give it some space, okay? And then reread them in the light of this additional time. And then if you have co-authors, you should discuss at length with your co-authors possible responses and what to do next with revising or maybe submitting to another journal. If you're resubmitting to the same journal, it's usually not worthwhile if you've been given an outright rejection. But if you feel the critiques are flawed, that there's fundamental statements of fact made by referees that are absolutely wrong, and you can demonstrate this, well, you should feel free to write a letter to the editor and in a respectful manner, challenge the critiques that you have a problem with, okay? But I'm just going to say, from a practical standpoint, this usually does not prove to be fruitful, but some cases it does, okay? So with a conditional acceptance, all of the authors respond suitably to the referee's comments. Everybody needs to see all of the comments and be given an opportunity to weigh in and to also review and approve the revised manuscript. This is another important point that novice authors don't know. You do not necessarily have to make all of the changes indicated by the referees unless you are explicitly told to do so by the editor, okay? What you're trying to do is adequately address the major points. You also can rebut and contest any points, but you have to provide compelling arguments, okay? You prepare a detailed letter of response describing exactly what changes you've made in the manuscript to the original manuscript. If the reviewers numbered their comments, you should refer to that numbering system in your responses. If you find errors that were overlooked by the referees or maybe something that you identified post-submission that you wanted to correct. You should identify these in your cover letter, and editors are usually very happy to find that you identified these things and are agreeable to fixing them. Some journals return your revised papers to the original referees. Alternatively, the editor might decide directly to whether not to accept your revised manuscript, or maybe a section editor or associate editors might make that decision. Editors might, under certain circumstances, want to send to an additional reviewer, such as a statistician. Regardless, you're going to get a response to your revised manuscript. And sometimes the editor will request that you make further changes. So you're making a second revision, sometimes a third revision, and all of those above rules same apply. Once the paper is accepted, you'll receive a formal notification, typically an email. Retain this. This is a proof of acceptance in case you want to cite the work elsewhere. If you want to cite it, for instance, sending to a grant funding agency, a study section, to know that this manuscript that was under review previously is now accepted and in press. Some journals immediately post the revised version of the manuscript on their websites, called e-published ahead of print. It's a manuscript version before the page is set up by the publisher. This is another very good reason to make sure that everything is 100% correct in the final version that's submitted to the journal. So you'll receive page proofs of your manuscript from the publisher. Before it's typeset, it will undergo technical editing. There are sub-editors that are expert in preparing papers for printing. They're good at picking up errors, inconsistency, putting paper into the journal style. And then the journals usually expect a rapid turnaround, 24 to 48 hours is standard, to be emailed back with a final version with any kind of corrections on the proofs, and make sure the editor is informed, the changes, corresponding authors, contact information. For instance, maybe you've moved in the interim to another institution, or you made an error in the order of authors. You need to ask permission to change that order. And normally all of the changes are marked directly on the proofs. It's a very good idea to provide a cover letter reiterating exactly what corrections were made. And now you just let the process take place. Again, I mentioned at the outset of my talk, this recommendations for the conduct of reporting, editing, and publication of scholarly work in medical journals published by the ICMJE. I highly recommend you to go to this website and to download and to read this. This is free, and it's a very valuable resource. It will also cover what we talk about, differentiation between authorship versus contributorship. And the take-home message here is that you should give credit where credit is due. So all persons who are designated as an author should qualify as being an author, and all of those who qualify should be listed. In other words, you shouldn't exclude someone who rightfully should have been included as a co-author. On the flip side, you shouldn't be including anybody as a co-author who didn't qualify, and I'm going to talk about what are those qualifications. All other contributions that were insufficient to qualify for authorship should be listed in the acknowledgments section. So what is this concept of earned authorship? 3 essential points: the conception and design or analysis and interpretation of the data, the drafting, the original drafting of the manuscript, or revising the article critically for important intellectual content. That's the fundamental criterion. And the final approval of the draft that is being submitted for publication. All 3 of these conditions must apply for anybody who's listed on the author byline. Briefly, I just need to go into the current definition of research misconduct. And this is the federal, US federal government Office of Research Integrity's definition. Research misconduct is defined as fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in proposing, performing, or reviewing research, or in reporting the results. So if you're proposing, let's say a grant proposal, but you fabricated or falsified or plagiarized information, you're engaged in misconduct. Even if you're in the middle of performing the experiments and any of these three things are done, that's misconduct. Certainly if you're reviewing a manuscript submitted by somebody else or a grant proposal with privileged information, that's misconduct. And as we're talking about more pertinent today, reporting your research results for publication. So just so that you know, the definition of fabrication is making up data or results and recording or reporting them. Falsification is manipulating research materials, equipment, or processes, or changing or omitting data or results such that the research is not accurately represented in the research record. And finally, plagiarism is the appropriation of another person's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving appropriate credit. Do not do this. There are other ethical violations that you should avoid. One is, I alluded to previously, multiple submissions, that you're submitting the exact same manuscript to multiple journals at the same time. Or worse, duplicate publication. You've now submitted multiple versions of your manuscript to different journals, and now you've published the same work in different venues, different journals. This is strictly unethical and should not be done. There are a variety of electronic publishing resources. You can find literally thousands of these by doing a Google search. You should be aware of the fact that there is something called as a preprint server. So BioRxiv, Cold Spring Harbor has a preprint server where you can submit for priority or precedent your work. This is a non-peer-reviewed vehicle. You can utilize this exact material that is posted on a preprint server when you submit for a peer-reviewed journal publication, except that you must give the citation to this prior work. So that's all that I wanted to cover today. And so I'm going to turn this now basically back to Ankita and Avon to handle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fleisler, for your presentation. We do have several questions in the chat that I'll read out. For audience members, feel free to add more questions and we'll get to as many as we can. So you mentioned this sort of at the end of the talk, Dr. Fleisler, but could you please say a few words about how editors view preprint servers? Does posting to a preprint server like bioRxiv negatively affect your chances for publication?
Very good and really timely question. So most editors do not look askance at work that is appearing on a preprint server because they realize that it is not peer reviewed. So it could have errors, but it is important that your work ultimately is peer reviewed and approved for publication. So you're not held, it's not held against you. However, I have to tell you that all manuscripts that are submitted for review in most days, certainly for all the Elsevier journals that I'm aware of, they are scrutinized right up front by plagiarism software detecting platforms such as Authenticate. And anytime I see an Authenticate score of 75% or greater, it makes my eyes bug out first, but then I go to the report to find out why they got that score. And almost always it's because the work is posted on a preprint server. Okay, so you will not be accused of plagiarism because it's your own work, it's not peer reviewed, and it's an authorized source. What has to happen is if your manuscript is accepted for peer-reviewed publication in a journal, you now have to make a notation to the preprint server that now the precedent is now assigned to the peer-reviewed publication. Okay, so very, very important, and more people are posting their work to preprint server.
Great. So our next question is, if a journal does not ask for a graphical abstract, would it be acceptable to include one as one of the figures if you don't already have too many other figures?
It is acceptable. So typically people will put that in their conclusion section or summary. That is a nice way to sum up the entirety of the manuscript. It will be up to the editors to whether or not they will want to include that.
Great. So why do some journals cost money to publish and others don't? How are these journals perceived throughout the scientific community?
Okay, this is a dicey question. So journals, publishing houses are in the business to make money. Okay, they are not altruistic. They're not interested in your education, okay, or your gaining knowledge. Okay, they're there to make money. And there are some journals, and a lot of these what we call predatory journals, where you get solicited to submit a manuscript. Usually they say something like totally unrealistic, like today's the 27th of April. Hey, we'd like your manuscript by the 29th of April. Oh, and we'll accept your manuscript, but it will cost you $2,000 US. Steer clear of those opportunities. Other journals have bona fide costs associated. They have a staff who they pay to process your manuscripts, put it into production. There are costs associated to publishing. As I mentioned, when in the cases of print journals, color reproduction is very expensive. Okay, it is less expensive if it's only online. So a lot of those costs have been scaled back tremendously. But for instance, we had a paper published or submitted recently and will be published. I'm anticipating to pay $3,800 for that paper. Well, if you have a modular NIH grant and you have, let's say, $50,000 of modular supply budget, that's a pretty big chunk of money. You can't afford to publish that many papers in a given supply year. So you have to consider the costs of publishing. Is it actually doable? Okay, it's a practical consideration. And more often than not, those very high tier journals, you're going to be paying for it.
All right, so we have time for just a few more questions. So when is the best time to decide author order, and what do you recommend for author disputes?
This is the most contentious issue of engaging in collaborations in research, okay? My suggestion, earlier, the best, okay? Talk to the people that you're intending to include in the study and have a group discussion and have it understood by everybody who has contributed, who's going to be the first author. Are there going to be joint first authors given equal credit? And there's a way of doing that by putting a little asterisk and an explicit statement saying these two authors contributed equally. Who's going to be the corresponding author, the last author, and the order and the number. All of this can be highly contentious. Or work it out early on, not the day before you're submitting the manuscript, okay? That's not a good time. And you should have a process in place for dealing with conflicts. And this may involve, for instance, a designated ethics review officer at your institution. It might be your department chair or vice chair of research. It may be a committee that's established in your department. But almost every university has a structure of how to deal with these kinds of conflicts. And in fact, in NIH grant applications, you must make explicit provisions on conflict resolution if you have a collaboration, particularly a multi-PI grant.
Fantastic. All right, so we are narrowing in on time. So sorry we didn't get to everyone's question, but we'll do one last one. And I think this is on the minds of many young researchers. As may I ask, as a junior scholar, how many publications or impact factor journals should we aim for to succeed in academia?
Oh my, yeah, that's very difficult because it's going to vary on the discipline. For instance, certain journals have very high impact factor in your discipline, whereas others just haven't reached that status yet. There is no magical number that I can recommend to you. If you look at any of the chats that are going on that the ASCB runs, like we just had one yesterday for people who want to know about how to apply for faculty positions. This kind of question comes up all the time. Unfortunately, there is no one answer for this. What my general hand-waving argument is, shoot for the highest impact factor you can. Numbers of publication matters less these days than the impact of your work, okay? I would be very happy to have 5 papers in Science and Nature and Cell than 25 papers in low-tier journals, okay? So what is the significance of your work? How does it impact your field? That is the most important thing.
Fantastic. So thank you so much, Dr. Fleisler. This was a fantastic webinar. And thank you to our participants. We'd like to point you to our survey, which is located on the slide. And the next webinar will be the NIH BioSketch Wonderful Tool with Dr. Bart Trawick on May 5th. So thank you so much for attending. And again, Dr. Fleisler, for your fantastic webinar.
My pleasure, and also reminding people that this has been recorded, so you will be able to get access to this.
Yes, thank you so much.
And you can also email me at any time. I'm happy to respond to you.